"Here comes the old ATM," my daughter-in-law said with a laugh. And just like that, the entire backyard went quiet for half a second before the laughter followed. I stood there at the edge of the patio, one hand still holding the small casserole dish I'd brought, feeling the weight of those words settle somewhere deep in my chest, heavier than I expected, heavier than they should have been for something said so casually, so effortlessly, like it had been practiced before I ever arrived. It was Daniel's idea to host the family reunion this year. He'd told me over the phone 2 weeks earlier, said it would be simple, just burgers and iced tea, nothing fancy, something to bring everyone together again after a long winter, and I had believed him. I always believed him. So I spent the morning in my kitchen measuring out ingredients, wrapping the dish carefully in foil, choosing a light blue cardigan because the weather report said it might dip into the 60s by evening, thinking, this would be one of those days you remember for the right reasons. The backyard looked exactly like the kind of place memories are supposed to be made. Folding tables lined with red and white checkered cloths, a grill smoking gently in the corner, kids chasing each other across the lawn with plastic cups in their hands, someone's playlist humming softly from a speaker near the porch steps. Everything bathed in that warm, late afternoon sunlight that makes even ordinary moments feel like something worth holding on to. And for a brief second, before the words landed, I thought maybe that's what this would be, just another good day with family. I forced a small smile, the kind that doesn't quite reach your eyes but passes well enough in photographs, and I stepped forward as if nothing had happened, as if I hadn't just been reduced to a nickname that turned years of quiet sacrifice into a punchline, placing the dish down on the table beside a bowl of potato salad someone else had brought, nodding politely at relatives who either hadn't heard or chose not to react. I couldn't tell which was worse. Sabrina was still smiling, still playing the gracious host, introducing people, handing out drinks, moving through the crowd with that effortless charm she wore so well. And Daniel stood beside her, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a bottle of soda, smiling too, not correcting her, not even glancing at me long enough to acknowledge what had just been said, as if it were harmless, as if it were true. I adjusted the sleeve of my cardigan, smoothing it down slowly, giving myself something to focus on, something small and manageable, because reacting would have meant explaining, and explaining would have meant admitting that it hurt, and I wasn't ready to give them that. Instead, I took a glass of iced tea from the table, the condensation cold against my fingers, and moved toward one of the empty chairs near the edge of the yard where I could see everything without being in the center of it, where I could listen without being expected to speak, where I could watch. Because that was the thing about being called something like that, about hearing it out loud in front of everyone. It changes the way you see the room, the way you hear every laugh, every comment, every passing glance. It sharpens everything. Like someone turned the focus knob on a lens you didn't know you were looking through. And suddenly I wasn't just part of the reunion anymore. I was observing it, noticing who laughed too quickly, who looked away, who leaned in closer to Sabrina when she spoke, as if this version of me, this old ATM, was already something they understood, something they'd accepted long before I ever heard the name. I took a slow sip of my tea, letting the cold settle my throat, and I smiled again, softer this time, steadier, because if they were going to show me who they thought I was, then the least I could do was pay attention, really pay attention, to everything they were about to reveal. I sat there long enough for the ice in my glass to melt into thin, watery tea, watching the reunion unfold as if I had been quietly moved from the center of the story to the edges of it, where everything becomes clearer whether you want it to or not. And the longer I stayed still, the more I noticed the rhythm of the afternoon, the way conversations drifted in and out, the way laughter rose and fell, the way certain words kept circling back like they belonged there. Daniel moved from group to group with the easy confidence he had learned over the years, one hand always gesturing as he spoke, the other occasionally resting on Sabrina's back, as if anchoring himself to her presence, and every so often I would hear my name mentioned, never loudly, never in a way that demanded attention, but always tied to something practical, something useful, something that made me feel less like a person and more like a solution waiting to be asked for. "Mom helped us out when we were short last year," he said at one point to a cousin I barely recognized, his tone light, almost proud, and the cousin nodded with a smile that felt polite but distant, like they were hearing about a tool that worked well rather than a woman who had given up something to make that help possible. I took another slow sip of my tea and let the sweetness sit on my tongue, focusing on the taste instead of the words, but they kept coming anyway, slipping through the spaces between conversations, carried on the breeze along with the smell of grilled onions and charcoal. Sabrina laughed easily, the kind of laugh that drew people in, and she had a way of leaning closer when she spoke, lowering her voice just enough to make others feel included, and I watched as she did it again near the kitchen door, her hand lightly touching someone's arm as she spoke, her eyes flicking briefly in my direction before returning to her audience, and I did not need to hear every word to understand the shape of the conversation. Still, some words found their way to me, clear enough to leave no room for misunderstanding. "She does not mind," Sabrina said softly, though not softly enough. "It makes her feel needed." There was a pause, followed by a quiet chuckle from the person she was speaking to, and something in that moment settled into place inside me, not sharp like pain, not heavy like grief, but steady, like a door closing without a sound. I set my glass down on the small table beside me and folded my hands in my lap, noticing how calm they looked, how still, as if they belonged to someone else. Entirely, someone who had already accepted what I was only just beginning to understand. Across the yard, one of the children tripped and fell, and for a brief second everyone's attention shifted, voices rising with concern before settling again when the child stood up laughing, brushing grass from their knees, and the reunion resumed its easy, comfortable rhythm, untouched by the small disruption, and I realized then how simple it was for things to return to normal when the disruption did not matter to most people. I looked around at the faces that were supposed to be familiar, at the small clusters of conversation, at the shared jokes and easy smiles, and I felt the distance more clearly than I ever had before, not because anyone had pushed me away in a way that could be named, but because I had been quietly repositioned over time, moved from the center of their lives to a place where my presence was measured by what I provided rather than who I was. I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting the sounds of the reunion wash over me without trying to follow any one conversation, and for the first time that afternoon, I stopped trying to fit myself back into a space that no longer existed, choosing instead to watch, to listen, and to remember, because there was a difference between being included and being used, and I was beginning to understand exactly which one I had been all along. I did not move from my chair, but my mind did, slipping backward through the years with a clarity that felt almost uncomfortable, like looking at something too bright for too long, because once you begin to see a pattern, it becomes impossible to unsee it, and suddenly small moments that once felt ordinary begin to rearrange themselves into something else entirely, something that makes more sense than it ever did before. I remembered the first time Daniel had asked for help after he and Sabrina got engaged, how he had stood in my kitchen, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, explaining that they were just short on the down payment for their first house, how his voice carried that familiar mix of confidence and hesitation, and how I had smiled without thinking, already reaching for my checkbook before he even finished the sentence, telling him that family takes care of each other, believing it with every part of me. I remembered the way Sabrina had hugged me that day, tight and warm, her voice bright as she thanked me, calling me generous, calling me a blessing, and I had carried those words with me for months afterward, replaying them in quiet moments as proof that I had done the right thing. Then there was the hospital bill when their first child was born early, the way Daniel had called late at night, his voice strained, explaining the costs, the insurance complications, the uncertainty, and I had not hesitated then either, transferring money the next morning without asking for details, telling him to focus on his family, telling myself that this was what being a mother meant. Each memory came back with a level of detail I had not allowed myself to sit with before, the envelopes, the bank statements, the small sacrifices that never felt like sacrifices at the time because they were wrapped in love, or what I thought was love, and I could see now how easily those moments had been absorbed into a larger expectation, how quickly they had stopped being acts of kindness and started becoming part of a system that no one ever named out loud. I thought about the summer Sabrina had decided to go back to school, how she had asked if I could watch the children during the week. Just for a few months, she had said, just until things settled, and those months had stretched quietly into a year, then longer, until my days revolved around school pickups, lunches, homework, and bedtime stories, and I had told my friends I was lucky to be so involved, that I would not trade it for anything, even when I felt the tiredness settle into my bones, in a way that did not quite go away. I remembered holidays too, the ones where I had insisted on covering everything so that Daniel and Sabrina could relax, the plane tickets, the cabin rentals, the groceries for a house full of people, and how everyone had smiled, how they had thanked me, how natural it had all seemed, as if this was simply my role, something I had stepped into without noticing when it began or how it might end. Back then, I did not keep track, not in any meaningful way, because keeping track would have felt wrong. It would have suggested that there was a balance to be maintained, a line that could be crossed, and I did not believe in lines when it came to family. I believed in giving until there was nothing left to give and trusting that it would matter in ways that could not be measured. Sitting there in that chair, listening to the distant hum of conversation and the occasional burst of laughter, I realized that it had been measured after all, just not by me, and not in the way I had imagined. And the difference between those two things felt like the quietest kind of betrayal, the kind that does not announce itself with raised voices or broken trust in a single moment, but instead reveals itself slowly, piece by piece, until you are left looking at a life you thought you understood and seeing it for what it has been all along. I remained seated, but my attention sharpened when I noticed Sabrina step inside the house, her voice lowering just enough to suggest privacy, without actually creating it. And something in the way she glanced over her shoulder made me follow, not with my feet, but with my focus, my ears tuning in the way they do when you already suspect that what you are about to hear will confirm something you have been trying not to believe. The sliding door had been left slightly open, just enough for the sounds of the backyard to drift inside, and for voices inside to slip back out. And I could see the outline of Sabrina near the kitchen counter, her posture relaxed, one hand resting lightly on the edge as she spoke to someone I could not see clearly, though the response came in soft murmurs that suggested agreement rather than surprise. "We just need to keep things smooth," she said, her tone casual, almost amused. "She does not question anything as long as it feels like family." There was a small pause, the kind that happens when someone nods or smiles, and then she continued, a little more confidently. "The cabin in July is already set. Daniel said he would talk to her next week, make it sound like it was her idea. You know how she likes feeling like she is helping." I felt my fingers tighten slightly around the edge of my chair, not enough for anyone to notice, but enough for me to register the shift inside myself, that quiet movement from uncertainty to something more defined, something steadier. The conversation inside continued, drifting between small details about travel dates and expenses, about who would bring what, about how it would all come together. And what struck me was not the plan itself, but the assumption behind it, the ease with which my role had been assigned without my presence, without my voice, as if I were a line item in a budget rather than a person who might have thoughts of her own. I did not need to hear every word after that, because the shape of it was already clear, the intention laid out in plain terms that did not require interpretation, and I found myself looking down at my hands again, noticing how still they were, how composed, as if they had already accepted something my mind was only beginning to process. Outside, the reunion carried on. Someone called out for more drinks, a burst of laughter followed, and the normalcy of it all felt almost surreal, like a scene playing out on a stage where only one person has been given the full script. I leaned back slightly, letting the sounds of both worlds overlap, the cheerful noise of the backyard and the quieter, more revealing tones from inside the house. And for the first time that afternoon, I did not feel confused or even hurt in the way I might have expected. Instead, there was a clarity that settled in slowly, like the last piece of a puzzle finding its place. It was not just the nickname, not just a careless joke that had gone too far. It was the system behind it, the pattern that had been built over years of small decisions and quiet expectations, each one reinforcing the idea that I would always be there to fill the gap, to cover the cost, to make things easier without ever asking what it might be costing me. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, not to escape but to steady myself, and when I opened them again, I did not look toward the house or the people inside it. I looked out across the yard instead, at the faces that still felt familiar in some distant way, at the life that continued around me unchanged, and I understood then that nothing had shifted for them, not yet, but something had shifted for me, something quiet and irreversible, and I knew that whatever came next would not be decided in a single moment of confrontation, but in a series of choices I had yet to make. Choices that would finally belong to me. I did not return to the house, and I did not confront anyone. Not then, because there was a kind of power in knowing something they thought I did not. A quiet advantage that I was not ready to give up for the sake of a moment that would change nothing except the volume of their voices. And I had no interest in raising my voice just to be heard by people who had already decided what I was worth. Instead, I stayed where I was, letting the late afternoon stretch into early evening, watching as the sunlight softened and the shadows grew longer across the grass, as if the day itself were settling into something calmer, something more honest. And in that calm, I felt something else begin to take shape inside me, something that did not feel like anger or even sadness, but more like a careful awareness, the kind that comes when you finally stop explaining things away. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps approach, light and hesitant, and when I turned my head slightly, I saw Grace standing a few feet away, holding a paper plate she did not seem interested in eating from, her eyes studying me in a way that suggested she had been watching longer than I realized. "Aunt Evelyn," she said softly, lowering herself into the chair beside mine, her voice carrying a gentleness that felt different from the rest of the afternoon. "Are you all right?" It was a simple question, but it was asked in a way that did not assume the answer, and for a moment I considered giving the usual response, the polite smile, the easy reassurance, the kind of answer that keeps everything smooth and uncomplicated, but something about the way she looked at me made that feel unnecessary. "I am fine," I said, and the words were not entirely untrue, just incomplete, and she seemed to understand that without asking me to explain. We sat in silence for a few seconds, listening to the sounds of the reunion behind us, the clink of glasses, the murmur of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter, and then Grace exhaled quietly, as if she had been holding something back. "I heard what she said earlier," she admitted, her voice dropping even lower, "and I did not like it." I nodded once, not because I needed confirmation, but because it felt right to acknowledge that someone else had seen it too, that I had not imagined the tone or the meaning behind it. Grace shifted slightly in her chair, setting her plate down on the table without touching the food, and then she added, "It is not the first time, you know." I turned my head just enough to look at her fully, and she met my gaze without hesitation, her expression steady. "She says things like that when you are not around," Grace continued. "Jokes, comments, little remarks that everyone laughs at because it is easier than questioning it." The words settled between us, not heavy, not dramatic, just clear, and I felt that same quiet certainty return, the kind that does not need to be proven because it already aligns with what you have begun to understand on your own. "And Daniel?" I asked, my voice calm, almost curious, and Grace hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "He does not stop her," she said carefully. "Sometimes he adds to it. Not in a mean way, just like it is normal." I looked back out at the yard, at the people who were still laughing and talking as if nothing had shifted, and I realized that for them, nothing had. Not yet, because the system they had built still worked, still provided what they needed without interruption. Grace leaned a little closer, her voice lowering further as she added, "I also heard them talking about the cabin trip in July. They are already counting on you to cover most of it. They were saying Daniel would bring it up next week. Make it sound casual." I let out a small breath, not a sigh, just a quiet release, and nodded again, more slowly this time, because what she was telling me did not surprise me anymore. It only confirmed what I had already begun to see. We sat there for another moment, the two of us slightly removed from the rest of the gathering, and I placed my hands back in my lap, feeling their steadiness, their control, and I understood then that this was the moment something shifted not just in my awareness, but in my intention, that whatever came next would not be guided by habit or expectation, but by choice. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like something worth holding on to. Grace did not rush to fill the silence after that, and I appreciated that more than anything she could have said, because there is a kind of respect in letting a person sit with the truth without trying to soften it. And I realized that was something I had not been given in a very long time. I nodded once more, then turned slightly toward her, my voice steady when I spoke. "Thank you for telling me." And she gave a small, almost relieved smile, as if she had been carrying something that no longer belonged to her. We sat like that for a while longer, the noise of the reunion continuing behind us, but it felt farther away now, less relevant, like something happening in another space that I no longer needed to step back into in the same way. Eventually, Grace stood up, brushing her hands lightly against her jeans, and before she walked away, she said quietly, "You deserve better than that." And I watched her go without responding, not because I disagreed, but because I was not ready to put that thought into words just yet. When I turned back toward the yard, I saw Daniel approaching, his expression relaxed, the same easy smile on his face. And for a moment, I wondered how much of that ease came from never having to question the role he had placed me in. "Mom," he said, pulling up a chair beside me without waiting for an invitation. "You have been quiet out here. Everything okay?" His tone was casual, but there was something underneath it, something practiced, as if he already expected a certain kind of answer, the kind that would keep things moving smoothly. I met his gaze briefly, then looked back out at the yard, keeping my voice even. "I am just enjoying the evening," I said, and it was not entirely untrue, just carefully incomplete. He nodded, satisfied, and leaned back in his chair, stretching his legs out in front of him. "Good, good," he replied, taking a sip from his drink before continuing. "Hey, I was actually meaning to talk to you about something, but it can wait until next week, no rush." The words were delivered lightly, almost as an afterthought, but I felt them land with a clarity that would have been impossible just a few hours earlier. I did not ask what it was, and he did not elaborate, both of us moving through a familiar pattern that suddenly felt very different from my side of it. Instead, I turned my head slightly and asked, "How is work going?" Shifting the conversation to something neutral, something that required nothing from me except polite interest, and he launched into an explanation about a project, his voice animated, his hands moving as he spoke, and I listened, nodding occasionally, but my attention was no longer in the same place it had always been. As he talked, I noticed how easily he filled the space, how naturally he assumed I would listen, would support, would be there in the same way I always had been, and for the first time, I allowed myself to consider what it would mean to step back from that expectation, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention, but quietly, deliberately, in ways that would only become clear over time. When he finished, he glanced at me as if waiting for a response, and I gave him a small smile, one that felt different from the ones I had offered earlier, less automatic, more intentional. "That sounds like a lot," I said simply, and he nodded, satisfied again, not noticing what I had not said, not noticing what I had begun to withhold. We sat together for a few more minutes, the conversation drifting into smaller, safer topics, and then he stood up, clapping a hand lightly on my shoulder before heading back toward the center of the yard, already being called over by someone else. I watched him go, noticing the ease in his step, the way he moved without hesitation, and I understood then that nothing had changed for him, not yet, because he had not been given a reason to think it had. I looked down at my hands one more time, then reached for my glass, taking a slow sip as the last of the ice melted away, and in that quiet moment, I made a decision that did not need to be spoken out loud, a decision that would not be announced or explained, but carried forward in small, steady choices. Because for the first time in years, I was no longer thinking about how to keep everything running smoothly for everyone else. I was thinking about what it would mean to stop. The rest of the evening unfolded the way evenings like that always do. Plates were cleared, chairs were folded, people began gathering their things in small, unspoken signals that it was time to leave, and I moved through it all with the same calm, measured pace I had held on to since that moment in the afternoon when everything shifted inside me, offering polite goodbyes, accepting brief hugs, returning smiles that no longer carried the same weight they once did. Sabrina approached me near the driveway, her expression warm, almost affectionate, as if nothing had ever been said, as if the day had been exactly what it appeared to be on the surface. "I am so glad you came," she said, her voice light, her hand resting briefly on my arm, and I looked at her for a moment, really looked at her, noticing the ease in her eyes, the confidence in her posture, the quiet assumption that everything was as it should be. "It was a nice gathering," I replied, my tone even, offering her nothing more and nothing less than the words themselves, and she smiled, satisfied, already turning to greet someone else before I had fully stepped away. Daniel walked me to my car, carrying the empty casserole dish without being asked, and for a brief second, The gesture felt familiar in a way that almost made me pause, almost made me question whether I was seeing things too clearly. But then he spoke, and the clarity returned. "We should do something like this again soon," he said, placing the dish carefully in the passenger seat. "It is good for everyone to stay connected." I nodded, closing the car door slowly, my hand resting on the frame for just a moment longer than necessary. "Yes," I said, "it is good to see how everyone is doing." He smiled, hearing what he expected to hear, not noticing what had changed beneath it, and after a brief hug, he stepped back, waving as I pulled out of the driveway. The drive home was quiet, the road stretching out in front of me in long, steady lines, the kind of drive that usually invites reflection, but tonight it felt different, less like looking back and more like preparing to move forward, and I kept my hands steady on the wheel, my eyes focused on the road, letting the events of the day settle into something clear and structured in my mind. When I reached my house, I did not turn on the television or fill the silence with noise. Instead, I walked into the kitchen, set my keys down in their usual place, and stood there for a moment, taking in the stillness, the absence of expectation, the simple fact that this space belonged entirely to me. I opened a drawer and took out a small notepad, the one I used for grocery lists and reminders, and for the first time, I began to write something different, not a list of things to do for others, but a list of things I needed to review, accounts, documents, decisions I had put off for years because there had always been something more immediate, something more urgent that belonged to someone else. I wrote slowly, deliberately, each word placed with intention, not rushed, not emotional, just clear, because clarity was what I had been missing, and now that I had it, I had no intention of letting it slip away. I paused after a few lines, looking down at the page, and realized that this was the first step, not a dramatic one, not something anyone else would notice, but something that mattered all the same, because it marked the point where I stopped reacting and started deciding. I set the pen down gently, then picked it up again, adding one more line at the bottom of the page, a simple reminder to myself that did not need to be explained to anyone else. And as I closed the notepad and placed it back in the drawer, I felt that same quiet steadiness settle in again, not heavy, not overwhelming, just present, and I understood then that whatever came next would not be about proving anything to anyone else. It would be about changing the way I moved through my own life, one choice at a time. The next morning arrived quietly, the kind of still, early light filtering through the kitchen window that usually made me think about small routines, coffee, breakfast, the start of another ordinary day. But this time there was nothing ordinary about the way I moved through it, nothing automatic about the choices I made, because the list I had written the night before was still there, resting exactly where I had left it, waiting, not with urgency, but with a kind of calm insistence that felt entirely new. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table, not turning on the television, not reaching for my phone, just sitting with the silence long enough to hear my own thoughts without interruption. And then I opened the notepad again, reading each line slowly, letting the words settle into something actionable rather than abstract. The first thing I did was something I had postponed for years. I called the office of Mr. Russell Dean, the attorney who had handled my husband's estate, and when his assistant answered, I scheduled an appointment for later that week, my voice steady, my request simple, and when I hung up, I did not feel nervous or uncertain. I felt prepared. After that, I moved through the house with a different kind of awareness, opening drawers, pulling out folders, gathering documents I had not looked at in a long time, bank statements, insurance policies, property records, all the pieces of a life that had slowly become intertwined with other people's needs. And as I laid them out on the dining table, I realized how much of it I had allowed to remain unexamined, not out of neglect, but out of trust. I worked through the morning without rushing, sorting, organizing, making notes in the margins of papers that had once felt too complicated or too unnecessary to question, and with each small step, I felt something settle into place, not just control, but clarity, the kind that does not come from reacting to a problem, but from understanding it fully. By the time the afternoon light shifted across the room, I had a clearer picture of everything that had been quietly supporting the life Daniel and Sabrina had grown used to, and for the first time, I allowed myself to consider what would happen if that support changed, not abruptly, not dramatically, but deliberately. I did not have to imagine it for long, because my phone rang just after 3 o'clock, Daniel's name appearing on the screen exactly as I had expected it would, and I let it ring once, twice, before answering, giving myself just enough time to steady my voice. "Hi, Mom," he said, his tone easy, familiar. "I hope I am not catching you at a bad time." I glanced down at the papers spread out in front of me, then back toward the window, where the sunlight had begun to soften again. "No, I was just at home," I replied, and he continued without hesitation. "Sabrina and I were talking about this summer, and we had an idea for a family trip, nothing too big, just a cabin by the lake, somewhere everyone can relax, and we thought it might be nice if we all went together." I listened without interrupting, letting him finish the explanation, the details, the casual way he framed it, just as Grace had said he would. And when he paused, waiting for my response, I did not rush to fill the silence the way I always had before. Instead, I let a small moment pass, long enough for the shift to register, even if he could not yet name it. "That sounds like a nice idea," I said finally, my voice calm, measured, and then I added, "But I am reviewing my finances right now, so I will need to think about what I can and cannot commit to." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, not long, just enough to break the smooth rhythm he had expected, and when he spoke again, his tone had changed slightly, still polite, but edged with something new, something uncertain. "Of course," he said. "No rush, we can talk about it later." I nodded, even though he could not see it. "Yes," I replied, "we will." And when the call ended, I set the phone down gently beside the papers, noticing how quiet the room felt again, how steady everything remained, and for the first time, I understood that the change had already begun, not in anything dramatic or visible, but in the simple fact that I had answered differently, and that difference was enough to shift everything that would come next. The appointment with Mr. Russell Dean took place 2 days later in an office that had not changed in years, the same dark wood desk, the same neatly arranged folders, the same quiet atmosphere that seemed designed to make people think carefully before they spoke. And as I sat across from him, I realized how long it had been since I had come here for anything that belonged solely to me. He greeted me warmly, asked a few polite questions, and then waited, giving me the space to explain why I had come, and I appreciated that more than anything, because it allowed me to choose my words with intention rather than reacting out of emotion. "I would like to review everything," I said, my voice calm, my hands resting lightly in my lap. "My accounts, my will, any documents that involve my son." He nodded once, not surprised, not questioning, simply reaching for a file and opening it with practiced ease. And as he began to go over the details, I listened carefully, asking questions where I needed clarity, making notes in the margins of the papers he placed in front of me, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving through each point with a steadiness that felt both new and entirely natural. We spoke about beneficiary designations, about access to accounts, about the structure of the trust my husband had set up years ago, and with each explanation, I could see more clearly how much I had left unchanged simply because it had always worked, because there had never been a reason to question it until now. "You have options," Mr. Dean said at one point, looking at me over the top of his glasses, "more than you may realize," and I met his gaze without looking away, understanding that this was not about taking anything away from anyone else. It was about deciding what I was willing to continue giving. By the time I left his office, I had made several decisions, none of them dramatic, none of them impulsive, but all of them deliberate, adjustments to documents, changes to access, small shifts that would not be visible from the outside, but would change the structure underneath in ways that mattered. When I stepped back into the afternoon light, I paused for a moment on the sidewalk, letting the air settle around me, and I felt that same quiet steadiness return, stronger now, more defined, as if something that had been uncertain before had finally taken its proper shape. That evening, I returned home and placed the updated documents neatly in a folder, setting it in a drawer that only I used, not hiding it, not guarding it, simply placing it where it belonged, under my control. A few days later, I made a call of my own, not in response to a request, not as a reaction, but as an invitation. I called Daniel and suggested that he and Sabrina come over for dinner the following weekend. Nothing elaborate, just something simple, something familiar. And he agreed without hesitation, his voice carrying that same easy confidence I had come to recognize. that same expectation that things would unfold the way they always had. I spent the next few days preparing, not just the meal, but the space, setting the table with care, choosing dishes I knew they liked, creating an evening that looked, on the surface, exactly like every other gathering we had shared over the years, because there is a certain power in familiarity, in allowing people to step into a situation believing they understand it completely. On the evening they arrived, I greeted them at the door with a smile that felt calm and genuine, not forced, not strained, simply present, and as they stepped inside, taking in the familiar surroundings, I could see that nothing about the setting raised any questions for them. Nothing suggested that anything had changed. We sat down to dinner, the conversation starting easily, moving through the usual topics, work, plans, small updates, and I listened, responding when appropriate, allowing the rhythm to settle into something comfortable, something expected, and then, at the right moment, when the conversation paused naturally, I set my fork down gently beside my plate and looked at them both, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a clarity that did not need to be. Explained. I have been reviewing my finances and my documents, I said, my voice steady, my tone even, and I have made some decisions about how I will be handling things moving forward. Daniel glanced at Sabrina briefly, then back at me, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face for just a moment before he smiled again, as if preparing to respond in the way he always had. But this time, I did not leave space for assumption. This time, I continued, calmly, clearly, in a way that left no room for misunderstanding, because this was no longer about what they expected, it was about what I had decided.